Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another week of Adult Bible Fellowship, digital Adult Bible Fellowship, I guess. We are in the middle of, I'm not sure if it's optimistic to say the middle. I think we're in the middle. We're in the middle of a study called How the Story Ends, taking a look at the end times events in the Bible and trying to figure out how they fit together and just get a sense of what the scripture says about how the world's going to come to an end and all the great stuff of Jesus' return and the end of the world and Armageddon and tribulation and all those buzzwords that you've heard from time to time. And in order to do that, in order to get to the end and understand the end properly, you really have to have a panoramic view of the study of the Old Testament, really. You have to understand the Old Testament well if you want to understand what the Bible has to say about the end times. In fact, I guarantee you will make all kinds of mistakes in your understanding of Scripture if you come into the last book of the Bible without reading any of the stuff or understanding fully the stuff that comes first. So I've been going back to the beginning and talking a lot about the big picture. And one of the ways that I've been doing that is by looking at the covenants that God made in the Old Testament. Because a key feature of the covenants God made with people at various times and various places are promises. And some of these promises are fulfilled, and some of these promises are unfulfilled. And it's usually the unfulfilled promises that relate to what we think of as end-time prophecies or end-time events. So let's look at these covenants, figure out what the promises are or were, and figure out later on how they fit into God's program for how the world is going to wrap things up. Okay? And we talked about three big ones so far, and I'm just going to review it by taking a look at the screen or the board behind me. First of all, we have the Abrahamic covenant, right? Oh, before I go any further, let me just say there are brand new notes for today that are available on our church's website, fbchh.org. On the resources tab, you go about halfway down, you'll see ABF notes. These should be updated to reflect the lesson notes for today. So if you want to print those out or at least have them up there digitally while I'm speaking, it may help you to follow what I'm saying a little bit better, or at least keep a record of what I'm saying so that later on when you're reviewing, you can just kind of cut past all the stuff I say and get to the main point. So here we go. Three big covenants so far, and the biggest one of them all, and the umbrella under which all the other covenants fit, I believe, is the Abrahamic covenant God made with Abraham early on in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, starting in chapter 12, but really it's kind of laid out in chapter 15 and also in chapter 17. And this is an eternal covenant, an unconditional covenant, which means that it depends solely on God's faithfulness, not on Abram's faithfulness. So in a covenant, normally you have two parties, and both parties are responsible to carry out certain duties, I guess you could say. I know, Jess Graves, I know you love that word. Obligations, responsibilities, right? I have my part to play, you have your part to play. And either one of us can break the covenant if we don't fulfill our end of the bargain. Well, this covenant that God made with Abraham was different than that. Abraham was all ready to commit himself to being an equal partner in this covenant, and God put him to sleep, and then God signed on the dotted line himself, which implies that God alone bears the responsibility for making sure that this covenant works itself out. This is God's plan for how he's going to redeem not just one group of people, but use one group of people to redeem the world. And there's three big parts of this covenant, okay? The first part is what I'm calling the land. God promises a homeland to Abraham and his descendants. But descendants is probably the one I should have mentioned first. Descendants is another one. When Abram gets his covenant, he is an old man with no kids, and God provides him children, and then children's children, grandchildren, so on, until there's a nation of people. And eventually, so big they form their own country with a king and a kingdom and everything. So land, descendants, and then there's this more nebulous, vague one called blessing. And he says this, you will be blessed, Abram, and your descendants will be blessed. And then he says, through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, God's blessings are of all different kinds in the Bible. There's material blessings, physical blessings. There's health, there's prosperity, there's money, there's abundance, right? There's all those things that we would love to have on our portfolio ourselves, right? But then there's also other kinds of blessings as well, spiritual blessings. There's salvation. protection. There's rescue, someone we can call when we're in trouble to bail us out of our problems. All kinds of other issues, forgiveness, things like that. These are, I think, sort of all encapsulated under this idea of blessing. So that's the Abrahamic covenant. God says, look, Abram, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give you a homeland. I'm going to give you a descendant that a group of descendants that become a nation, that have their own kingdom, that are going to be living in that land, and then I'm going to bless you, and then I'm going to bless the world through you. You're going to be my gateway through which I pour my blessing and my love into the world. Okay? So time went by. Israel goes down into Egypt. They become enslaved there, and they grow into this huge nation. So the first part of God's promise has come true. The descendants are multiplied. But there's still no land, and there's no kingdom even, and there's no blessing. So they're a group of people that have a connection to God through Abraham, but they're down in Egypt, and they're slaves, and they cry out to God. So what does God do? God sets them free. And he marches them on a road towards the promised land he had promised to Abraham that he was going to give to them. But on the way, they stopped at a mountain called Sinai, and God entered into a second covenant. This is a sub-covenant, and what I mean by that is it's under the umbrella of the Abrahamic covenant. If the Mosaic covenant gets broken, it doesn't invalidate the Abrahamic covenant. It only invalidates this one piece of the covenant, okay? And this covenant is what I'm calling a lease agreement, okay? A lease agreement with Abram's descendants. And this lease agreement was, look, you're headed toward the promised land. This is my land. I'm the owner, God says. You're just going to be my tenants. You're going to live in the land I give you, and I want you to live a certain way while you're in the land. I want you to obey a certain code of ethics, code of morals. You're going to handle disputes in a certain way. You're going to worship in a specific way. You're going to dress in a certain way. You're going to eat in a specific way. He gives them all these expectations that he wants them to live up to. And the idea was that if you live up to these expectations, I will bless you. That's the promise of blessing if you obey. And also the nations will notice you and realize, wow, this is an amazing group of people. I wonder what they have going for them. And they would draw the nations to come to know the God of Israel. So it's a really cool plan. It's an awesome idea. And the problem is, though, is that God says, but here's the flip side. If you choose to disobey, if you choose to become disloyal, if you chase after other gods, then all the blessings for obedience are going to go away. And eventually I'm going to punish you, and I'm going to take away those blessings, and I'm going to give you curses instead. And if you keep it up and you don't come back to your senses and you don't come back to me, eventually there's a clause in there that's my exile or eviction clause, and I will kick you out of the land. Don't test me. Obey my commands, obey my expectations, and if you do, everything's going to be fine. If you don't and you refuse to turn back, you get stubborn in your hearts, then eventually at some point there's going to be an eviction from the land. And of course, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. Now, the cool thing is that in the Mosaic covenant itself, there was a prophecy. And the prophecy was from Moses, the guy who gave the law. And the prophecy was, yes, you're going to disobey. Yes, you're going to go into exile. But God will bring you back to the land. And God will, in the process, also heal your hearts that are broken with sin so that you'll do the right things and you'll be able to obey the law. And then he'll restore all the blessings to you that you had before. So Moses paints both a negative picture of the future, and then through the negative picture of the future, there is a positive view of the future. And we know that the history of the land is that that's exactly what happened. Israel went off into exile because of her idolatry against God. Nebuchadnezzar and them took her out. And bad news. But when they came back, because they repented while they were away in exile, and God brought them back to the land, but there was something that was missing. Their hearts weren't changed. And not only were their hearts not changed, but there was no kingdom to come back to. They were already slaves, and still slaves of the Persian Empire and then later the Roman Empire. So the question becomes, okay, so how are the rest of the promises going to be fulfilled? Because we don't have our promises of blessing that have been restored. Our hearts are still broken, and there's no kingdom. What's going on? And to answer that, God established a third covenant, which is also a sub-covenant of the Abrahamic covenant. And it's the one that I'm connecting here to this promise of descendants or a nation or a kingdom. And that's what's called the Davidic covenant. This is an arrangement that God made with David, who was you could say he was the second king of Israel, but truly he was the first king that God had chosen for the nation. That because David was a man after God's own heart, he had something internally going on that Saul, his predecessor, did not. So God took the kingdom from Saul, gave it to David. And then he made an agreement with David and said, David, your sons will always have the right, always, to sit on the throne. In other words, you have a right to be king, and your family is going to be the ruling family of Israel forever. You will always have a right. And God says, I promise you, the chain will not be broken. You will always have a descendant throughout history who will have the right to stand and sit on your throne, to sit on your throne someday. Because God still intended to renew his kingdom, to restore his kingdom, and all the blessings that come with the restored kingdom. So, we talked about that last week. And we talked about the fact that the prophets, specifically Isaiah and Jeremiah, were the ones that talk about it the most, although they're not the only ones. Trust me, I had to whittle it down to just a few passages to share with you last week. But Isaiah and Jeremiah talk a lot about the responsibility that David has to, that there would come a descendant of David. And this descendant of David would basically fulfill the rest of the unfulfilled promises. So the transformation of the heart, that's going to come through Messiah. The restoration of the kingdom, that's also going to happen through this Messiah. So the children of Israel were waiting, right? They're back in the land, but things aren't the way they used to be. They're still slaves and under foreign domination. So now what? Well, now we wait for the Messiah. The Messiah will be a descendant of David who will come, and when he comes, he will restore all the kingdom. He'll restore the kingdom blessings. He'll punish the wicked. He'll lift up the oppressed. He'll give justice and righteousness to the world, and he will rule over this kingdom of peace that will spread throughout the entire world, and all the nations will know God through the influence of Messiah and his holy, righteous kingdom. So that's what the children of Israel are waiting for. But I talked to you about the end of it that I believe, and I think Scripture is really clear, it links Jesus with this coming Messiah. Jesus is the descendant of David. It's ironic. He's a descendant of David both through his mother and through his father. And through both of them, he has a legitimate right to claim to be the descendant of David who could sit on the throne and take leadership and become the king of Israel. Okay. On top of it, the fact that he's God's son as well. So, I mean, he's a remarkable figure. He's the unifying figure of Old and New Testament. He's the hinge that the Old and the New Testaments just swing on, is Jesus Christ. He's the center, and he holds it all together. But here's the crazy thing, right? And this is where we ended last week. And then trust me, we're going to get into some new stuff today. So last week we said, okay, so I believe this was Jesus, this Messiah that was going to come to restore the kingdom. But Jesus lived and died. And if you believe the story of the Bible, he came to life again, and then he went off to heaven. But here's the thing. The kingdom didn't come. The restoration of the kingdom of David, of Israel, that had been promised all the way back in the Old Testament, it didn't come. The Romans, when Jesus died, the Romans were still in charge. In fact, a few years later, about 35 years later, there was another rebellion in Judah, and it started up in the north, but then it spread down to the south, as these things often did back then. And then the Romans came in with legions and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. All right, so not only are they not independent and having their own king, the son of David, to rule over them, and not only are they not at the top of the table of nations and can kind of see this kingdom of peace and prosperity. Not only is that not true, but they're not only, their land's been devastated, their city's been devastated, their temple, their capital, everything has been devastated. Once again, the people of Israel, the Jews, have been scattered again throughout all the earth. Now, some remained there in the land, of course, and there always were, but many of them were relocated other places, almost like a second exile. So what do we do with that? If Jesus was the Messiah, why didn't he make destroying the Romans a priority? That's sure what the Old Testament prophets seem to suggest. Why didn't he make establishing a kingdom on earth, a peace and prosperity that would spread throughout the entire world? Why didn't he make that a priority? is Jesus who he really claimed to be or not? Why didn't Jesus, if he's the Messiah, fulfill the promises that Moses prophesied in Deuteronomy chapter 30? The reason why he didn't, and the reason why he didn't set up the kingdom and restore the kingdom blessings to Israel, I believe, is explained by the existence of another covenant. Another covenant that needed to be made between God and his people before they could enjoy the blessings of the restored kingdom. So in other words, there's a problem. There's a major problem that has to be fixed before they can fix the problem of Rome, before they can fix the problem of slavery to foreign nations. A bigger problem, as much as it doesn't seem like there could be a bigger problem than being a slave in your own country to foreign powers that are abusing you and taking advantage of you and pressing you. As much as that seems like that's about as bad as it can get, Jesus and I think the Old Testament and the New Testament are unanimous in their agreement that there's a much bigger problem that's affecting the people that Jesus had to deal with first before he could restore the kingdom to Israel. Okay? And here's my suggestion. If you look on second page, I think it's at the bottom, you may see page 19. It's really the second of the 3 pages that you're getting today. The problem is this. The problem are wayward, sickened hearts. Hearts. That's the very first blank. Hearts. I want to go all the way back to the beginning of the Mosaic covenant, the very, very dawn of it, when it was just kind of being signed. The ink isn't even dry yet on the covenant that God made with Moses. And Moses tells the story about how this happened. He says, and the Lord, verse 25. So the people are talking to Moses. Moses is they're at the mountain, Mount Sinai, right? And they're at the bottom of the hill. And they see God is up on the mountain. And God has already told them some of the things he expects of them, but they couldn't handle it. It freaked them out. In fact, take a look at this. Listen to this. It says, as soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. This is Deuteronomy 5:23. Deuteronomy 5:23 and 24 now. And you said, behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God speak with man, and man still live. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore, we will die. You want to talk about a terrifying experience? How about experiencing the audible voice of God as his presence is burning up the mountain behind you? Like, mountains are big, and God's glory and his majesty is so intense. It's literally the mountain is on fire, and then there's a voice coming from the fire down to you on the ground. Yeah, you better believe you're terrified. And they say, Moses, we need you to go and talk to God. He says this, for who, verse 26, is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of fire as we have and has still lived? Well, the answer to that is Moses. Moses has heard God's voice before. He's survived. So let's send him up there. Verse 27, they say, go near and hear all that the Lord our God will say. Right? So the people send Moses up the mountain, probably felt like on a suicide mission, right? Up the mountain to hear whatever it is God wanted to say. And then he says, and then you speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you. Right? So Moses, you're the go-between. You go up to God, you hear what God has to say, you come back down, you speak to us. In other words, we can handle you, Moses. I don't think we can handle God directly. And then he says this, and we will hear and we will do it. Now that's a promise. That's a commitment. That's them signing on the dotted line. They're like, look, we can't handle hearing this from God directly. So Moses, you go talk to God for us. You figure out what God wants. You bring those words back down to us. You tell us, and we agree ahead of time, we're going to do it. We're going to hear them, and we're going to do them. Now, look at verse 28. This is really fascinating. And the Lord heard your words when you spoke to me. And the Lord said to me, I have heard the words of this people, which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. What have they spoken? Well, they've spoken that they're terrified of God. God's like, yeah, well, I'm kind of terrifying. And then they say, I don't think we can handle this ourselves. And God's like, yeah, you probably can't. We should send Moses up. And God's like, yeah, that's a good idea. And then the last part, everything that you say, God, we will hear and we will do. And God says, yes. Yes, that's what I want. I want people who are committed to doing what I say, who are committed to following my commands, who are committed to living out this lease agreement that I'm going to make with them. They're going to live up to this incredible standard, and the nations around are going to see and be transformed by their example. And God's like, yes. But then look at verse 29. Oh, that they had such a heart as this always, to fear me and to keep my commandments, that it may go well with them and with their descendants forever. Because God knows something that nobody else in the story knows. He knows exactly how this story is going to play out, doesn't he? He knows that their promise to hear and to do everything that God says is going to be broken immediately. It's actually going to be broken before Moses can even come back down the mountain to give them the full message of what he wanted them to do. They're going to start worshiping another god almost immediately, and that's going to be the history of these people. They're going to have times where they're close to God, and they say, everything the Lord says, we hear and we do. And then they're going to have multiple adulteries, where they break God's heart, they break God's laws, they break God's commandments, they abandon him for somebody else they think is more appropriate and more attractive to them in the moment, who can help them more than God can. And they're going to chase after him, and God knows what's coming. And so he's like, yes, your words are great. I love those words. But then he says, I wish they had the heart to do it always. Because if they had the heart, listen to this is important. If they had the heart that they have right now, and they stuck with that, and they kept my commandments, then do you know what would happen? They would live in the land forever under my blessing. Everything would turn out the way I want it to turn out, the way they want it to turn out. But God says to them, I wish their hearts were able to do what their mouths have promised. Right? Have you heard the expression, your mouth is writing a check that your body can't cash? Well, Israel is writing a check with her mouth that her willpower and her loyalty to God are not going to be able to cash over the course of their 2,000, 3,000 year history. It's just not going to happen consistently. God knows it. Now, skip ahead to Deuteronomy chapter 10. I find this one really fascinating. Deuteronomy 10, verse 16. Or I'll start with verse 15, okay? Moses is recounting to the people, again, a little bit of the story about how God started this whole covenant and the basis of this Mosaic covenant. He says in verse 15, yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples, as you are on this day. He's like, look, you don't realize how good you have it. You've been chosen out of all the nations to have this special relationship with God, to have this special moral code that's going to be this incredible lease agreement that you're going to be able to live in the land, you'll be able to live prosperously, and you're able to fulfill the mission I have for you. You have no idea how good you have it. And so Moses pleads. You can see him pleading with the people, begging the people in verse 16. And it's going to use language that's a little bit strange, but I'm going to try to explain in a minute, so don't get discouraged by it. Verse 16 says this, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart and be no longer stubborn. It's almost like Moses can see off into the future, and he can see their rebellion that is about to happen, and he's begging them ahead of time, please, 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 don't do that. Please don't set your heart against God. And he uses a really kind of a strange expression, which if you don't understand the Mosaic covenant then and the Abrahamic covenant, then it doesn't make any sense. He says, circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Now, circumcision was a symbol that was actually given during the Abrahamic covenant. Circumcision was a way to physically mark the males of the population, obviously, for obvious reasons. But it was a mark in their bodies that typified their ownership to God, that they were loyal to God, that they belonged to God and to God's people. It was sort of like an identifying marker that you were one of the crowd. You were one of the family. You were a part of the team. And in fact, God says, look, if parents decide not to circumcise their sons, then what you realize what that means is they're cut off from the community. Like, circumcision is your passport into the community. It's your proof that you belong here. It's proof that you are actually a part of the family of God, that God is your father, that God is your master, that God is your owner. It's a sign of ownership. And so what Moses is begging them, he's saying, look, don't just circumcise your bodies, the foreskin of your body. Don't do that. Or he's saying, do that. You're supposed to do that. But please don't just do it on the outside. Circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Let your heart be marked by your ownership and your belonging and your loyalty to God. In other words, it doesn't just matter what your parents do for you when you're 8 days old. What matters is you in your heart, setting yourself apart to God, saying, God, I'm on your team. I'm loyal to you. I'm a part of your family. I'm not going to go chasing after other gods. I'm going to do everything I can to obey this lease agreement. And when I fall short, I'm going to take advantage of the offerings in the lease agreement to repair the damage between us because I am your kid. And it's not just in my body, it's in my heart. What's the problem with Israel? God's like, oh, they don't have the heart. In Deuteronomy 5 and here in Deuteronomy 10, Moses begs them, please, please don't just be committed to God in your bodies on the outside with your externalism. Be committed to God in your heart. Give God everything from the inside. That's the only way this is going to work. The only way this lease agreement is going to last, the only way the Mosaic covenant is going to be able to work is if your hearts are circumcised. So 800 years go by, and a lot of history, a lot of ups and downs, and the prophet Jeremiah was writing a letter to the children of Israel in the very last days of the monarchy. Okay? So David has come and gone. His sons have come and gone. And now there's a new son of David on the throne. His name is Zedekiah. And Zedekiah is destined to be the last son of David to be officially the king of Judah and Israel. And in the middle of that time, Jeremiah is writing to the people, and it's almost eerie. In Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 3 through 4, it's pretty eerie to hear what he has to say because it's clear he's been reading Moses and he understands the Moses thing and he's got a report. It's been 800 years. My question is, well, were Moses' fears justified? Were God's laments justified? How did it turn out? Maybe the people did better than we expected. It's possible, I guess. Jeremiah 800 years later says this in Jeremiah 4, 3 through 4. For thus says the Lord to the men of Judah and Jerusalem, break up your fallow ground and sow not among the thorns. Verse 4. Circumcise yourselves to the Lord. Remove the foreskin of your hearts, O men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest my wrath go forth like fire and burn with none to quench it because of the evil of your deeds. 800 years later, Jeremiah is saying to the people of Israel the exact same thing Moses pled with them 800 years before. Circumcise your hearts. Your hearts are still not devoted to God. You may have a circumcised body. Congratulations. That means your parents were faithful to obey their part of the lease agreement, but your hearts are far from God. Your loyalties are shared with other gods and with other commitments. This has to be exclusive to God alone, or it's not going to work. The people have had 800 years to figure this out, to gradually, incrementally grow and change. And they haven't. They've squandered every opportunity, and the generation that's in Jeremiah's time, the last generation before Babylon cuts the head off the snake, is in the exact same spot with uncircumcised hearts. In fact, if you skip ahead to Jeremiah chapter 9, Jeremiah goes a little bit more into detail. He says this, here's his sad conclusion. In chapter 9, verse 25, he says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will punish all those who are circumcised merely in the flesh." Did you catch that? In other words, having the symbol in your body that you belong to God doesn't matter if your heart is not circumcised to God. Who cares if you have some defining mark or tattoo that says, "I'm an Israelite," if your heart is not committed to the God of Israel? And God knows it. So God's like, look, having the tattoo, having the circumcision in your body that marks you as one of my people will not save you. It's only if your heart is circumcised that this will be able to save you from the judgment and the destruction that's coming your way. But here's what he says here. I'm going to judge all those who are circumcised merely in the flesh. Then he talks about all the different nations. Egypt, Judah, Edom, the sons of Ammon, Moab, and all who dwell in the desert who cut the corners of their hair. Not sure what that's about. I guess it's like again, a mark of people who lived in the desert. For all these nations are uncircumcised. Now, did you notice what nation he included with all of those? Now, all the other ones, yeah, there's no Egyptians that are circumcised. There's no Edomites. There's no sons of Ammon. There's no Moabites. There's no desert dwellers that are circumcised. Why? Because they don't belong to the nation of Israel. They don't belong to God. God's not their owner. God's not their master. Okay, fine. But who's in the middle of all those nations? It's a very unexpected name. It's Judah. Judah is supposed to be exempt from this. Judah is supposed to be, they could probably point to all of their males and say, look, all of our males are circumcised. God, what are you talking about? Of course, we've done what you told us to do. We're circumcised in our foreskin and all that wonderful stuff that I don't like to talk about in a mixed audience. And luckily none of you are in the room to embarrass me. We've done that. We checked it off the box. It's off the list. And then he says in verse 26, the rest of it, "And all the house of Israel are uncircumcised in heart." I think there's a blank right there. Uncircumcised in heart. In other words, this is internal. The problem is internal. The problem is the heart of the people. They can't keep the Mosaic covenant. They can't stay faithful. They can't obey. They can't love. They can't be faithful to God the way they're supposed to. They just can't. Their hearts are messed up. Their hearts are broken. Jeremiah goes even further in Jeremiah 17 to talk about their hearts. And I think you might have heard this verse before. I've heard it quoted, sometimes out of context, but a lot of times in proper context. Wow, that's awful. Verse 9 says this. I had lunch before I did this. Verse 9 says this. "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick." And then he asks this question, who can understand it? In other words, when you look inside at your own heart, when you look at the hearts of the people around you, you can't figure it out. It's tricky and it's sick. It's dying, it's crumbling, it's rotting, it's oozing gore and gross pus and stuff. That's your heart. You want to know what your heart looks like to God? Your heart looks like a decaying mass of raw flesh. It's just dying. It's filled with corruption, and it's tricky and deceitful. And the truth is if you truly knew the insides of your own heart the way God sees the insides of your heart, you wouldn't have a clue what to do about it. We all have plans on how to fix this in our lives and fix that in our lives. But when it comes down to it, we don't know how to fix ourselves. And even if we did know how, we wouldn't have the ability to do it. We wouldn't have the ability to do it. In fact, that's the next blank on your sheet there. It says, Israel's spiritual condition was beyond human intervention. Who can know it? Who can understand it? Who can grapple with it and give us the answers? Who can figure out a prescription for the heart? Nobody. No human can do that. No human is capable of doing that. And then God says in verse 10, to hint at where the story is headed, he says, I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. Who does the Lord suggest is the only person who understands and knows the reality of human hearts? It's the Lord, he himself. So apparently what Jeremiah is getting at is that the situation is so bad, there's no human that can fix it. There's no priest, there's no holy man, there's no good person in the world that can fix other people, and you certainly can't fix your own heart. It's beyond your hope. But there is a God who searches the heart, who tests the mind, and who will judge and give everyone what they deserve based on their behavior and their thoughts and intentions. There is a God who can deal with this problem. There's only a God. But he can fix the problem. He can deal with it. Okay? Now, so that's pretty desperately bad, right? Like that's the reason God can't just restore the kingdom. If he restores the kingdom to a bunch of people with those kinds of hearts, guess what's going to happen to the new kingdom in 5 minutes? They're going to destroy the new kingdom. Do you remember when God decided he was going to get rid of sin by drowning everybody except for Noah and his family because Noah's the good guy? Do you know what happens after the flood? The earth was still corrupted with sin. Why? Because humanity can't fix their own sin problem. You can't eliminate sin by just killing a bunch of people and hoping to start over with the good ones. Because frankly, there are no good ones. And that's what Jeremiah is saying. God knows our hearts. He's the only one who can do anything about this. Our hearts are messed up. So, a kingdom is no use to people with sick hearts, sinful hearts, because they'll just ruin the new kingdom just like they ruined the old kingdom. You know, just like we ruined the new world, just like we ruined the old world before Noah. And so, before God can give the kingdom back, he's got to do something about their hearts first. Okay? So what is it that they are going to do? I'll get back to that in just a moment. Okay, we're back. What is God going to do? How is God going to fix human hearts? The ironic thing is that God actually gives the solution all the way back in Deuteronomy in the prophecy that Moses gives as a part of the Mosaic covenant. So if you'll go back with me really quick to Deuteronomy chapter 30, what we have in Deuteronomy 30 is the short version of God's answer. So what's he going to do? We can't have the kingdom. The kingdom's not going to work until people's hearts are fixed. But people can't fix their own hearts. There's no human that can fix other people's hearts. So what happens in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6? Here's what Moses says. Moses says, "And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live." Do you catch that? So who's going to do it? The short answer is this, and fill in your blanks. God would heal and restore their hearts himself. In other words, you can't do it. You're too messed up. Your hearts are too broken and sick. So, flip side, here's the good news. God is going to do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. He's going to circumcise our hearts. He's going to step into the situation. He's going to get rid of our sin and take it 1,000,000 miles away from us. He's the one that's going to enable us now to love. Did you catch that? It's not just so that we stop breaking all the rules. Fine. But more importantly, God is going to restore our heart's ability to love him with all of our heart and with all of our soul. That's where the ability to obey comes from. It's from our ability to love. If you love someone, obeying them is not a problem. The problem we struggle obeying God is because we really don't love him. Not really in the moment, not more than we love something else. We can talk about it, we can do the external thing, but the internal thing always tells you what you really love. And when you act a certain way, it's because of your love problems, not because of just a willpower problem, okay? So God says, look, I'm going to fix your hearts so that you can love me. And as a result, you're going to be able to live. But that's going to happen after they come back to the land, they repent and all that stuff. God is going to take the initiative. He's going to circumcise their hearts himself so that they'll learn to love Yahweh and then be able to live as a result. Now, that's the short answer, but it leaves a lot out. Or I shouldn't say leaves a lot out. It's very vague, and there's a few gaps in our understanding as to exactly how God is going to pull this off. So let me give you a longer answer that takes into account what Jeremiah and Ezekiel suggest is the method that God is going to use to bring about this circumcision of the heart. Okay? And Jeremiah and Ezekiel are the only two prophets that specifically talk about this particular plan God has, and they do it in 4 passages. And what I want to do before I'm done today, and this one might run a little bit long, I'm not sure, but I want to hit 4 passages, 2 from Jeremiah and 2 from Ezekiel, that are going to lay out this plan for how God is going to be able to circumcise the hearts of the people so they'll love the Lord and then be able to live and be prosperous, and then to have the kingdom restored to them later once they have fixed hearts. Okay? So we're going to start this off, and I have a sentence here, and then we'll dive into the 4 passages. The prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel explained that God would circumcise their hearts. How? By establishing a new covenant with Israel. One that is different from the Mosaic covenant that they had repeatedly failed to keep. Here's what God says. God says there are flaws in this old covenant, this Mosaic covenant. There's flaws in the lease agreement. Now, I think it's very clear that he would not say that the flaw in the Mosaic covenant are the rules. The expectations, right? The fact that God has the bar set high. That is not the problem with the Mosaic covenant. In fact, you want to go all over the New Testament and they will say to you, no, the law is holy. It is perfect. It is good. It is wonderful. The expectations of the law, the expectations the law has of Israel are perfectly appropriate. There was nothing wrong with what God expected of his people. The problem was where the law was written. You're like, what? Let me try to explain. Jump down to Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah 31. Verse 31. 31. It's easy to remember. Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah says this. I'm going to read a big chunk of it, and I'm going to try to talk through what is going to be involved in this new covenant. Verse 31, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. Which one is he talking about? He's talking about the one they made at Mount Sinai, the Mosaic covenant. The one that has to do with the land and how they're supposed to live in the land. The lease agreement. He says, I'm going to make you a totally different kind of covenant. Why? Why do I need a new covenant? Because look at it says here in verse 32, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. So God is saying, look, this lease agreement was also a marriage commitment. You didn't realize it, but it was sort of a wedding thing going on. And in this marriage, you have certain responsibilities, and you've continually broke these responsibilities time and time again. So basically God's saying, I'm going to give them a covenant that they're not going to break. You're like, how are you going to do that, God? The humans you made the covenant with are the problem. It's not the covenant that's the problem. It's the people you made it with. And God's like, I gotcha, but here's how I'm going to fix that. Verse 33. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declared the Lord. Look at this. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. So what are the key factors in this covenant? And you can read verse 35 down to verse 40 for a little bit more detail. God emphasizes that this is an eternal thing, that I'm never going to abandon Israel. I'm not going to get rid of them. I'm going to make a new covenant with them. That's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to eliminate them and choose somebody else. I'm going to just throw out the old covenant, and I'm going to put in this place a new covenant. Now, what is different about this covenant? You ready? Number one, the first subblank here, God would internalize his law. God understands that the only way for us to be able to obey the law is if it's coming from inside of us. If our hearts desire to obey the law because we love the Lord, like it said in Deuteronomy chapter 30. You remember God's expectations in the Mosaic covenant. They were written on tablets of stone. They were written in an external way. And those expectations were brought to the people with broken hearts and with sick, diseased, sinful hearts. And they said, here you go. Here's the expectations. This is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to live up to. And they kept breaking it because their hearts were messed up. God says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to give you my law from the outside in. I'm going to put my law inside of you. I'm going to have the expectations that I have of you just bubble up naturally out of who you are. Now, I want to suggest to you this. God's expectations in the new covenant haven't changed. God hasn't lowered his standard. God hasn't said, well, I know you guys couldn't make it to a level 10, so our new covenant is going to be like, you can make it to 5. As long as you make it to 5, we're good. No, God's expectations are still up at 10. But now they're internalized. Now they're in our hearts. They're something that emerge and come from our hearts. Now, if our hearts were still the old, sick, diseased, sinful hearts, then that would be a problem, or at least I don't see it improving things much, but it's going to get better. We're going to find out more about this covenant and about what God's going to do to our hearts. But you got to understand, God's going to internalize everything. He's going to take law, instead of it being this command out there I have to obey, it's something inside, written on my heart that I want to obey from the inside out. Now, notice he also says too, everyone will know the Lord personally. That's the blank that goes there. Personally. Everybody will know the Lord personally. God is going to give everybody a personal, intimate knowledge of him. They're not going to need Moses to go up the mountain anymore and say, tell us what God said, because God's going to know them, each one. God's going to have a personal relationship with each person, from the least, and I think that probably means the youngest, the littlest, all the way to the greatest, the oldest, the most wise, the one who's been around the longest. Everybody's going to have a personal relationship with God. It's going to be intimate. It's going to be personal. Why? Because it's internalized. It's not just me, keeping rules on the outside, but I'm keeping my insides for myself. No. God's expectations and God's desires are going to be written on our hearts. And so we're going to live them out because they spring from inside of us. It's what we want. And we'll all know the Lord personally. And then he says this, verse 34, I will forgive their iniquity and I will remember their sin no more. Everyone will also be forgiven. They'll be forgiven. The slate wiped clean. And God says, you know what? What I have wiped clean, I will never remember again. I'm not going to bring it up. I'm not going to call it back the next time I'm mad and say, you remember what you did 2 years ago? I'm going to just let it go, and it's no longer going to be. It's like it never happened. It's like it never happened. I'm going to forgive everybody. Now, one chapter later, he kind of continues his thoughts. Let's jump in there because he's going to kind of fill in some of the gaps. That's just a little bit right there, talking about this important part of internalization of his law. But look at chapter 32, verses 37 to 40. Behold, God says, I will gather them from all the countries to which I drove them in my anger and my wrath and in great indignation. I will bring them back to this place and I will make them dwell in safety. So God promises right there, number one, under this passage, also a final regathering of all exiles to the promised land. Yes, some of the exiles went back when Cyrus, the king of Persia, said, hey, go back and build your temple, back in like 506 BC or 515, 516 BC, when he sent them back. Okay, great. That's fine. There is a presence, a remnant of Israel, but there's still exiles spread all out through the Persian Empire and throughout the rest of the world. God says, part of this covenant, I'm going to regather everybody who I have kicked off, who I've evicted from the land, and I'm going to bring them back to the land. Okay, so the land is going to be important in the new covenant. The land is super important in the new covenant. And also the descendants are really, really important in the new covenant. So God is saying, look, all the descendants of Abraham, I'm going to bring them back to the land. But then look at verse 38. He says this, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. Now, that's sort of a reinforcing of what is happening in the Abrahamic covenant and what God says under the Mosaic covenant and the Davidic covenant. But it's sort of like saying, look, but it's like, okay, so it's one thing if you're married to your partner, you marry your wife or your husband, and you've never been divorced, and you just stay faithful to one another your entire lives long. That's a wonderful, wonderful story. That's what I'm shooting for. That's what I'm working for. That's what I desire with my whole heart. But imagine you have a situation where you have a marriage, and that marriage is fractured by the chronic unfaithfulness of one partner in the marriage. And he runs away with another woman, or she runs away with another man. And then there's this process where that wayward spouse sees the error of their ways, comes back to the original partner, begs for forgiveness, and is forgiven and welcomed back into a new layer of that married relationship, and trust and reconciliation is established, and then they move forward into forever under that. Isn't that a different story? That's what God is saying here. It's like, look, Israel, I was married to you. I was faithful to you. We had this covenant going on here, and you betrayed me. And of course I had to kick you out of the land to all the different places that I kicked you out of the land. But then he's like, you know what? I'm going to bring you back someday. I'm going to bring you back to the land, and when I do, we're going to have that relationship restored. I will be your God. You will be my people. The blank there is a new intimacy with God. There'll be a new intimacy with God. Maybe I should have said a restored intimacy, because they lose their intimacy with God when they chase after other gods. But he's like, look, I'm going to bring you back, and we're going to be close again. We're going to be in that tight, perfect, beautiful relationship again. Then look at verse 39. I will give them, check this out, I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever. Listen to this. For their own good and the good of their children after them. So what's he saying here in this verse? What he's saying in this verse is, not only are you going to have a new intimacy with me, I'm going to give you a brand new heart. A new heart, right? Because isn't that the biggest problem? Their hearts are sick and broken and diseased with sin. And God's like, you know what? The only reason it's going to help to have my law written on your heart is that you're getting a brand new heart. And it's a heart that's not contaminated with sin. It's a heart that is not sick and diseased. It's a heart that is healthy, that knows how to love me. And so when I write my law on this new heart that you've got, you're going to obey willingly, and it's going to be a joy to you because you desire it more than anything else, because it's written inside of you and you long for it. And not only that, he says, this is going to be for your good and the good of your descendants. I read that, I can't help but hear the echo of Deuteronomy 5:29 when God says, oh, I wish they had that heart in them always, that it may go well with them and with their descendants. God is coming full circle. He's saying, remember what I said back at the beginning? One day we're going to have it. One day your heart is going to be new, and that restored heart is going to love me, and it's going to go well with you. You're going to obey naturally, and that natural obedience will lead to blessings for you and for your children forever. And then verse 40. Verse 40 says, I will make with them an everlasting covenant, and that I will not turn away from doing good to them. And I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. God just underscores again that this covenant that he's making, this new covenant, will be an everlasting covenant. In other words, the new covenant's not going to need to be replaced by a newer covenant or newest covenant. The Mosaic covenant needed to be replaced by one that's better. This one is going to be written on our hearts. It's going to imply a gift. It's going to include a gift of a brand new heart. And that new covenant will never need to be replaced. It's going to be the operating system of our hearts for the rest of eternity. Now skip ahead to Ezekiel chapter 11. Ezekiel is writing in exile. Okay, he's one of the prophets that went with the people off into exile, and God showed him various visions. And one of the things God gave him a vision of is of this new covenant. And I'll bet you, because Ezekiel came after Jeremiah, I bet you that Ezekiel has read Jeremiah 31. Because listen to this. This is amazing. Chapter 11, verses 17 through 20. Verse 17 says, "Therefore thus says the Lord God, I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel." Is that not the exact first verse that I read from you back in verse 33 of Jeremiah 31? It's almost the exact same concept. God is going to bring them back from where they've scattered and put them back in the land. Verse 18, "When they come there, they will remove from it all its detestable things and all its abominations, all the idols, all the false gods, all the gods they cheated with throughout their entire history. Israel's going to get rid of that once and for all. Why? Because something has changed on the inside." Verse 19, "And I will give them one heart." It's exactly quoting word for word what Jeremiah said in Jeremiah 31. "I will give them one heart, and a new spirit I will put within them." Now look, he adds a little bit of detail though. He says, "I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my rules and obey them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God." This is a direct connection to Jeremiah 31. I'm telling you, Ezekiel has read Jeremiah's prophecy, and he's commenting on it, and he's expanding on it, because he's saying, look, this is how I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to go in, and I'm going to surgically, spiritually speaking, of course, remove the old, dead, diseased, sick heart, and I'm going to throw it to the side, your heart of stone, a heart that can't beat, there's no blood flowing through it, it's dead. I'm going to throw that aside, and I'm going to put a new heart. I'm going to transplant a new heart into your chest, and then you will come to life. Come to life again. That's how God's going to do it. He's going to take the heart of stone out, and he's going to replace it with a heart of flesh, a living, breathing heart that loves and knows how to obey. And then he says, it's going to go well with you. It's all the same stuff. It just adds that little detail. And then one last passage, and with this, we're done for today. And I know we've run a little bit over today, and I apologize, but this is the way I got to get it done. I got to go on vacation. It's going to be fun. Here we go. Ezekiel 36. Ezekiel 36, and I want to jump ahead. If you read from verses 16 all the way down to verse 36, which is basically almost the end of the chapter, you're going to get another kind of discursus, or excursus, I should say, discussion on the new covenant. But he says here in verse 22, I want to start. He says, "Therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations to which you came." Verse 23, "And I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, and which you have profaned among them. And the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the Lord God, when through you I vindicate my holiness before their eyes." God says, my reputation is at stake. I've made promises. I am going to make action. I'm going to take action, and I am going to do something that is going to vindicate my holiness to the nations. So the nations look at me and my actions and say, oh, I see what he was doing all along. God isn't this God of this unfaithful people who don't love him. He must not be much of a God. God's like, no, you don't understand. I'm going to do something to turn around the opinion of the nations about me. Verse 24, "I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land." Does this sound familiar? I hope so, because it's the exact same thing that he said before in chapter 11, and then Jeremiah said back in 31 and 32. Verse 25, "I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleannesses, and from all your idols I will cleanse you." This is another element of the new covenant that he didn't discuss before, and Jeremiah doesn't discuss, is a cleansing. A cleansing. In the Old Testament, the priests would have to ritually wash themselves to be clean before they could go in and worship God in his presence. And if you touched like a dead body or whatever, you'd have to go wash yourself to be cleansed so that you could then have a re-entering into a relationship with God under the old covenant. And God says, you know what? To start off this new covenant, I'm going to, number one, cleanse my people from their uncleanness. And their uncleanness came because they were messing around with idols. The idols are what made them unclean. It says, I'm going to get rid of those idols, and I'm going to wash you and cleanse you so that you're clean. Then verse 26 says this, and I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. So God again reinforces, and here's a couple blanks. God will give his people a new heart, and he'll put a new spirit inside of them. Verse 26. And verse 27, and I'll put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. Verse 28, you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers. You shall be my people. I will be your God. Is this ringing a bell? Because I think it's been repeated like 5 times now. And I will deliver you from all your uncleannesses, and I will summon the grain and make it abundant and lay no famine upon you. I'll make the fruit of the tree and the increase of the field abundant, that you may never again suffer the disgrace of famine among the nations. So what else is God saying? The third blank's there, third subpoint. God will bless his people living in the land with abundance again. See, he changes their hearts first. Then he blesses them with the blessings of abundance. Then he restores what has been taken away. First, he's got to fix their hearts. First, he has to transform them and cleanse them and forgive them. Once he does that, once he changes fundamentally who they are, then they're ready for the material prosperity and blessings that he wants to pour upon them. Skip ahead to verse 35. I just want to show a couple other points that I think are really fascinating, really interesting. Verse 35, and they will say, this land that was desolate has become like what? He's talking about the land that they're living in. Because when the people are gone, it gets destroyed. It's basically just like this desolate land, like a desert. But when they come back, guess what's going to happen? This land has become like the Garden of Eden. And the waste and desolate and ruined cities are now fortified and inhabited. Did you catch that? The Bible does not refer to the Garden of Eden very often. Very, very rarely at all. In fact, I should have looked it up before this to let you know how many times. But this is one of the very few references to the Garden of Eden. Do you remember what the Garden of Eden was all about? Going all the way back to the beginning? Garden of Eden is the way humanity was supposed to be. It was the way life was always intended to be. The Garden of Eden was God's blueprint for what our existence was supposed to be like. And what he's saying is when this new covenant thing kicks in, guess what's going to happen? You're going to look around in this land and go, oh my gosh, we're back. We're back in the Garden of Eden. We're back in fellowship with God. We're back accomplishing the mission God made us for. We are fulfilling our purpose and we're living completely satisfied with all of our needs. And it's all because of this new covenant, this new arrangement God has made with us, where he's cleansed us and given us a new heart, brought us back to the land, given us abundance. Here's the blanks. God will rebuild and replant the land until it reminds people of the Garden of Eden. The cities will be rebuilt. The land will, all the vegetation will grow back, and you'll look at yourself and you go, I am in paradise. I'm in paradise. This is what life was always meant to be. And then look at verse 36. Verse 36 says this, then the nations that are left all around you shall know that I am Yahweh. I have rebuilt the ruined places and replanted that which was desolate. I am Yahweh. I have spoken. I will do it. Now, I kind of get a little bit animated there because I imagine God is pounding his chest at this point. He's like, you nations have thought throughout all history that I'm some chump, that I'm nobody. I'm just another one of your pathetic, pagan, useless, dead, empty gods. Well, when I do this, when I pull off the new covenant, when I make the desert bloom so that it's like the Garden of Eden again, and I bring all my people back and I transform their hearts so they love me and follow me and live up to the expectations I have for them, then you'll know. You will know who I am. There will be no doubting. There will be no questioning. There will be no mocking. There will be no dragging my name through the dirt. You will know who I am. Which ironically, right, is God's personal name, Yahweh. I am who I am. Then you'll know. Here's the next set of blanks. This will get the attention of the nations. When this happens, all the nations will wake up and go, oh my word, there is a God in Israel, and we need what he has. And this is how God is going to spread the blessing to the world. He blesses Israel so that he can bless the world. This is what's going to happen. And I love it. The next blank says, Yahweh takes all the responsibility to make this happen. He says, I am Yahweh. I will do it. It doesn't depend on Israel. It doesn't depend on the nations. It doesn't depend on a great person to show up. I will do this. I will do this. And I believe he ended up doing it by coming himself into the story as a man, Jesus Christ, the descendant of David, the Messiah, to sit on David's throne, to accomplish both purposes. But first, he had to accomplish the most important purpose, which was this. The order works like this. This is the last blank. God intends to make an internal transformation in his people before he restores the kingdom blessings. And that is what the new covenant is all about. It's about fixing our broken, dead hearts and changing them and cleansing them and forgiving them and putting something brand new inside of us so that we long to know God. We long to obey God. We long to live up to his expectations. And so we do. That's the new covenant. Now, that sounds like a great deal. And my question is, why didn't God just do it? Why didn't he just snap his fingers and say, hey, Israel, the Mosaic covenant was a mistake. Sorry, we're not going to do that anymore. Now we're going to do this new covenant. And so I'm just going to kind of like wipe off all the sin and everything that happened in the Mosaic covenant. And we'll just start over again with a new covenant. Unfortunately, apparently it seems like it doesn't work that way. How is this new covenant going to be made available to a broken, sinful people? There's still the problem of all the sin that was committed under the Mosaic covenant. There's still a price tag there. Who's going to pay that price, and how is it going to be paid so that we can have a new arrangement in place? You have to fulfill the old agreement before you can make a new one. How's God going to cancel the old one and establish a new covenant? Now, luckily for us, the prophet Isaiah and the writers of the New Testament, especially the writers of the Gospels, help us understand how God was going to bring his new covenant into being, into life. And if you come back next week, even though I took way longer than I should have today, it'll be shorter next week, I promise. If you come back next week, we're going to talk about how Isaiah prophesied and how the gospel writers recorded that God found a way to cancel the old covenant and establish the new covenant that eventually would lead to the restoration of the kingdom and all the blessings that come along with it, which is basically what the book of Revelation is all about. So come back next week. I'll be back from vacation. I'll have bags under my eyes. I'll look tired but happy. And I'll be looking forward to finishing out talking about the new covenant with you. Lord bless you guys. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.